IVM.
Hello and welcome to Simplified, the podcast that's like coconut oil, or like my friend Jagdish Singaram likes to call it, Mallu penicillin. It has.
Wait, what?
It can be used for multiple situations with varying degrees of effect, but at least it's friendly and ubiquitously available. And like coconut oil, we also freeze at 25 degrees centigrade because we are all Mumbai or more south based.
Yes.
So,
But we are not a husk of our former selves.
Yeah.
uh,
Also,
thick-skinned
like
though.
penicillin, people who are allergic to us are severely allergic to us. So haters will hate. Yes.
We are we are virtual, hence we are now real also.
This is all happening on the spot, by the way. We should
This is
see
what
our
happens.
faces. Right?
Yeah, this is what happens when you have coconut for a steady diet of coconut, just like how Jeeves has benefited from a steady diet of fish.
Fish.
I think if Jeeves was Mallu, I think Jeeves would have been a great Mallu character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
Anyway.
yeah. No. If Jeeves was a Ballu with fish and coconut oil, Bertie would never have got into the scrapes in the first place, and those books would never have been written. So good that Jeeves was not a Ballu.
This is like the other one where thank God that Isaac Newton was not a Mallu, because coconut would have fallen on his head instead. Instead of an apple.
Rajeshwar Jeevanand would have been Reginald Jeeves. So if anyone wants to give it a shot, I think we should start.
So before we move on to today's topic, before the session, I had asked you if there was some cool fact that you learned too late in life. Maybe I have one, but which I'll come to at the end. But Chuck, you want to tell us something?
Yeah, I learned that you don't need to respond to everything on Twitter. No, actually, no, that's not it. No, that's not it. That's not it. But I think for me, the most startling fact that I learned in the last few years is that not all cats are supposed to have milk, because most of them are lactose intolerant. And I think this is a big fact purely because we have grown up in childhood with Tom and Jerry thinking that cats love milk and all that. They do love milk, but it's not necessarily very good for most of them. So that was a fact that constantly surprises me and many people people writing to me asking for cat adoption tips. And I said, first thing, don't give them milk. And that always surprises them. So yeah, I think that would be mine.
Yeah. Amazing. They like the fat part of it, or
I genuinely don't know. I genuinely don't know, but many of them are lactose intolerant. So you have to figure out, give them a little milk, see whether they're puking or whether their poop is weird. And if not, then please continue. So yeah, I'm guessing it's the lactose part of it. Is lactose a fat or whatever? Sorry, don't know this much science also.
That way, cats are Mallus because they love fish and probably fried in coconut oil.
Yeah. And they don't listen. They refuse to listen to any kind of authority. That's also. They're definitely Mallus. Yeah. I knew a fact that I didn't know, and I knew it, and then I forgot what it was. And as I was just saying, I'm researching into the depths of my memory, and as Mr. Adani would say about airports in India, eventually it will come back. But at this time, I am completely at a loss. But I'll tell you one thing. So when I was a little kid, we used to go to marriages, weddings, and I used to always be amazed at the sheer length and elaborateness of these ceremonies. Why would Hindu weddings are really elaborate, right? So there's so much ritual and everything is really important, and you sit on the correct side of, so in some things, the bride has to sit on the left, the groom has they have to wear the right thing. It's important that you don't eat certain things, you do eat certain things, so on and so forth. And I was always under the impression that all this was because if you didn't do all of that right, you wouldn't get children. And then later I found out that was not the case.
That's a pity. That would have been a bloody good contraceptive, I must say.
So then sometime somewhere in the 8th standard, I said, oh my God, this is not true.
I
And
think
around that time, I became a non-believer.
Things that we learn, revelations that come to us in 6th, 7th, and 8th standard, I think should be excluded from this particular conversation.
Yeah.
Because then we'd have a complete episode on just that.
But yeah, I can't think of some. There are, of course, literally thousands of things that I didn't know. And one of them was about milk. Same thing. I didn't know that milk was not good generally for adults. We humans have developed lactose tolerance, but for some reason, not all humans, right? So some people are still lactose intolerant in a very bad way. They don't know that they are lactose intolerant, and then they take milk, and then all kinds of bad things happen to them.
They lack lactose tolerance.
There was this old English cricketer, I think his name was Fred Titmus, and he, in a forklift accident, he lost a couple of toes. The fact for the fact that England had him in the team shows that they were lactose tolerant. I can't believe they managed to get on.
Tennis community was Lacoste tolerant. Anyway, I think we can.
This is really bad, and I'm so sad that Srikanth is not over here too.
Lacoste tolerant should be a t-shirt, actually.
So we've gotten into a double fault now. Okay, so to extricate from this, my actual revelation happened this week, which is I didn't know that dandruff and dry scalp were two different conditions, which was actually mind-blowing for me. So I
literally mind-blowing.
Fairly early on that the main cause of dandruff is an oily scalp, right? So as a Malu, you grow up putting insane amount of coconut oil in your hair. And sometime once you move out of your house and go into a hostel, you start realizing that you don't need to use it. And it actually causes dandruff. But apparently, so the remedy is don't use oil and obviously use an anti-dandruff shampoo. But dry scalp is the opposite, which is that it is caused by your scalp not being moisturized enough. And both flake, but they flake differently. So the solution here is to just go back to coconut oil if you have dry scalp. I don't know why I'm oversharing, but I found it really fascinating.
That's all right. And it just took me back to my own days in a hostel where you had all these Mallu boys thinking that they looked very cool with their slick coconut oil doused hair, hence giving rise to the term extra virgin coconut oil.
I thought you were going back to the good old days when you had hair. Okay, no, sorry. We won't do
Let's
that.
move on to the actual topic. Why have you asked us to recount this?
Why am I talking about oil? Because of the Sherman Act in the US.
Wow. What a connect. My goodness. I was wondering where you were going with this when you told us this before we recorded. And as always, you're impressive, very impressive.
There's one more layer to this. So Sherman Act was basically the antitrust law in the US. I'm obviously getting a few facts wrong, but it was in the late 19th century, basically against the monopolization of certain things. Primarily Standard Oil, I think, was one of the entities that was getting into cartels and monopolies. So against that, this law was formed, and then later iterations of antitrust came about. And what is the new oil? It is data. So today we shall be talking about Google and digital advertising, and basically antitrust litigation that has been filed in the US against Google's digital advertising practices.
Lovely.
So basically this is a unredacted PDF, which is actually fairly short, and someone posted it on Twitter and I checked it out. And the cool part about this is because they have to prove that Google's digital advertising is a monopoly, and they have to obviously explain it to fairly older generation judges. They've written it in a manner that is a beautiful explainer for how digital advertising works. So I think it's the most friendly sort of text that I've read on this. We'll obviously link to it. So if you have the time and inclination, please read it. Because to be honest, the digital advertising industry, at least in India, thrives on one basic principle, which is information asymmetry. So you want to confuse your clients and basically, take your pound of flesh.
it is so sad that when the moment you started, it thrives on one thing. That could have been so many things, but I knew that, and I was like singing it with you. Information asymmetry, information asymmetry. I can almost imagine like the entire ad tech industry in India just, information asymmetry for the win. That's another T-shirt that we should have.
So, Naren, back in the day, obviously, how we've reached the stage of digital advertising is quite fascinating, right? So, early on, I'm sure you lost respect for marketers post your MBA because they were selling soap and snake oil through limited means of reaching out to people, right? And the basic idea there was if a person reads X newspaper or Y magazine, then they are likely to buy my product, which is in some senses a very...
Life was a lot simpler then. Going to carve up humanity into neat little categories based on what they read and where they went. And
And so basically at that point in time, the value or real money maker there was the ability to negotiate prices with various newspapers or magazines for slots, right? Because obviously they have a newspaper every day, but the ad supply and demand would need to be managed in a certain manner. Therefore, you had agencies negotiating prices because then they could, collect the pool of advertisers and have some this thing, right? And pass the value back on to the end advertiser and publisher, because publisher is anyone who, basically puts out an ad in this sense, right? So since then, when digital came about, the first thing that they did is basically copied this model to say, okay, it's the same thing. You're paying me for column inches of space on your this thing. So let me replicate that model. So I have a screen that is so many pixels in width. I will give you certain banner space there. And it worked in the exact same manner. So I'm buying space from your website and I'm basically going to pay you for that space. And this is fairly inefficient, right? Because it's not really linked to whether you're interested in a product or it is relevant, or what happens after that is also not very clear. So from there, obviously, we moved into the glorious era of pop-up ads, which I think I'm not sure if all our listeners are old enough to remember.
Those delightful things that made your every action on the internet so delightfully unpredictable.
Wait, what do you? They're not around.
You hardly visit websites in general, so I guess I don't nowadays. So
wow.
Pop-up ads, as in it opened in a secondary browser window. You don't remember from the dial-up days? They died a while.
They did? Okay, maybe I have to reevaluate the kind of websites I visit.
So in fact, the guy who invented it, this person called Ethan Zuckerman, actually put out an apology because the origin of this thing was that he was running one of those geosites kind of thing, basically early blogging platform, right? So he opened it up for people to basically put their own content. So it can be anything, but that means there's a lot of ad space, which these guys can then sell to advertisers. So he was, the sales team was presenting it to Ford to say, see, look how your ads are appearing. Let's go through some random blogs. And they found their ad featured on a blog, which was all about anal sex. So then obviously Ford was like, okay, we have back seats and all, but this is not how we want to appear.
We have tailpipes, but this is not what
So the solution was basically to disassociate the content on the page from the ad, therefore, bring up the ad in a new window. So it is not related to the content, right? I mean, okay, you might be visiting that blog, but this ad is appearing on a different page. From there, we've moved leaps and bounds, obviously, to where we stand today, where actually Google controls a lot of the ad space, right? How we got there is something that we explore after a quick break.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome back. We are on the edge of a very, very interesting topic. We're just going to dive into it. And that is, how Google came to be the lord and master of all digital advertising in the world.
Yeah.
Or
absolutely.
one of the lots.
One of the, yeah.
One of them, yeah.
Naren, did you know that? Just before Tony gets back, I just want to elaborate on that one of the lords thing. There's a stat that out of every $1 that is spent on digital advertising, around 70 cents goes to either Facebook, Amazon, or Google. It's absolutely staggering, and it's almost like every time a startup raises money by a venture capital, that is actually beneficial for Google and Facebook because they are going to spend that money on very efficient digital advertising. But I'm sure we'll get into that a little more later. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And that's why this whole thing has come about, right? So we spoke of pop-up ads, and then the later version of this was basically that you moved on from selling column inches of space to say, okay, there are actually better proxies to say that this is my target audience, which is all of the information that you give out on the internet, right? Which is why data is the new oil, obviously. So if as a brand or a marketer, I have defined my target audience as, males between the age of 25 to 34, living in urban cities, etc., then I can actually do targeting based on those parameters if they are available with certain information at the ad end, right? So two things basically happen. One is that you have the ability to target people based on who they are rather than where they go or what they read, which is actually seems very simple now, but I'm sure at that time it was a huge revolution to say we don't need to rely on what they read anymore. The second thing was basically a lot of websites popped up, and all of them have obviously lots of pages and lots of ad inventory, as we call it, or space to sell ads. Now, in the newspaper era, it was much simpler because there are a fixed number of slots and you could just sell it manually. Right now, because of the proliferation of this and based on how many people view pages, the number of units available multiply exponentially, right? So it becomes very inefficient for them to have people doing the sales for this. You needed algorithms to come in, right? So how would it work? And this happens when we visit every site right now, which is actually crazy. Is that let's say you load a certain website, Times of India, right? So, and at that page load, there is a certain space that is carved out for an ad, right? When the page loads, nobody knows what that ad is going to be. Okay. Correct. At page load, basically, there is a signal saying, okay, there is an ad space available. And also it is Narendra Shenoy from Bombay who's loaded this page. Now, who wants to bid for showing an ad to Narendra Shenoy, right? So then actually a whole full-fledged bid process happens at the back end while the page is still loading. And by the time the text appears, all of this is complete and the ad appears as well. Which means that if the three of us are loading the same page at the same time, we'll likely see three different ads based on who we are rather than the content of the page.
Yeah, and to just to further add to that, which ad you see depends on where you are, what sites you have visited before, if you have logged in, what site you visited from, and it could even be based on your Google search history, all kinds of things. Whether you've visited a certain website in the past, and that that same company's added. I mean, there's just so many factors that go behind this.
I'll just, since I know the least, let me try and summarize it. So you're saying that they know everything about everyone. So when a space becomes available, they are going to sort of filter all those people. So obviously, I mean, if it's something about cats, Chuck is going to be the most, the best kind of audience for that. If it's an ad about cat food. So the moment Google knows that Chuck is viewing a page and there's a space available, a cat food company should know about all of Chuck's characteristics and bid for it. So who is bidding against cat food company? Maybe someone hair oil. Okay, so I know that Chuck is not going to use hair oil. So how I'm just staggered how they match. Obviously all this is automated because it just blows my mind. I cannot imagine how, and yet this is exactly how the thing works, right?
Yeah,
it pretty much is. Yeah.
And that's what we shall try to simplify today, right? Because it is actually very, very fascinating that on page load within 100 milliseconds or 300 milliseconds, all of this action takes place behind the scenes. You don't even realize an ad appears in front of you.
Yeah.
Right? So how this thing happens is basically what we'll get into.
Yeah. And theoretically, and I just wanted to elaborate on Naren's point. If the cat company was not able to reach me, or suppose they were never considering digital advertising in the first place, then it might be something else which might be either less relevant or somebody who has bid less in order to reach me. It's completely fascinating. On paper, it's a brilliant business model that you have these intermediaries who are just basically connecting advertisers to end consumers and chopping up time and attention in various kinds of ways. It used to be the case before as well in newspaper advertising, but over there you had a fixed sort of thing. You can't change the ad depending on who is going to be reading it beyond controllable things like geography. Times of India will still have a different front page ad for, say, Chennai than to Bombay than to Delhi. But beyond that, the three of us are in Mumbai, and if we get Times of India, we are all going to see the same ad. It's not going to get any more granular than that because it's not possible logistically to do that. But on digital, like Tony said, it is possible, and that's what's pretty much driving the advertising industrial complex, as they call it. So one quick aside before we dive into this. This is something which has been and a disclaimer: I have zero idea about how the entire fascinating world of marketing. I assure you, most people working in the industry also are the same way.
Absolutely, you don't need to know anything about it to work.
I know. Even more embarrassing because I have an MBA, which I try to hush it up, except under moments of duress such as this one. But my point is this. So back in the day when I was studying, they told us, and they took great care to tell us all this, that advertising and sales are never correlated. Right? So that's what they should. And that was basically what the advertising industry used to survive on. Basically, you basically shout into the void, and you keep shouting on the hope that your sales, by the end of the day, you want to make sales, and you keep shouting till sales pick up. And they are never directly correlated. So you have to maintain an advertising noise, and it could be months, weeks, days, or even years before the desired outcome, which was extra sales, would happen.
Yeah.
And this was, they used to say that this sales promotion is not like that. If you have sales promotion, like you're giving some 1-on-2 offer and everything, that should directly give you an increase in sales, but advertising is not like that. Now, is that canard still true? So now you have people who are spending significant amounts. Actually, I know someone who has a startup, and they told me that they spend something like 50% of their spend on advertising, entirely on digital, everything on digital.
Yeah.
And so is the same thing applicable? Is it still that unconnected? Okay, would you still get away by saying that advertising and sales are not correlated?
No, not really. And that's why this industry continues to grow, right? I think the most famous quote that all marketers use is one from several years ago by John Wanamaker, which goes 50% of my advertising money is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which 50%.
Okay,
right?
so it's that's still the advertising industry stand. That you have to keep shouting into the void, but you don't expect results.
Yeah, that was the older version. And fascinatingly, my daughter was asking me yesterday, so what are you teaching? So I said marketing. So she's like, what is marketing? And I'm like, okay, if you have a shop, how do you tell people to come? So she said, why don't you put a huge signboard? I said, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then like only people who see the signboard can come. So she said, okay, then go around shouting to everyone saying you have a shop, which basically is actually marketing, is that you make noise hoping for people to come in. So what was missing in the earlier version, like you said, is the absence of a feedback loop, right? Which is necessary for any system to improve. So you have an ad put in a paper and then you track sales. Maybe you put in a number or something and see if the call volume spike. But everything, the attribution is not one-to-one and it is fairly broken. So you don't know what it results.
I'll just add one thing over here, Tony, before you jump in, and hopefully this will also answer Naren's question, maybe even throw a flashback to some of the things that you tried to block out from your memory in those 2 glorious years at MBA. Marketing broadly consists of advertising broadly consists of 2 things, right? One is things that are sales driven and one that is that helps to sort of build the brand in. And the second part can be absolutely anything. It can be a brand doing weird things, fun things, sponsoring a football team, all sorts of things. Anything that changes your perception of the brand. And then if that is followed up by a more functional ad, then that combination usually results in sales. So typically there is a balance between the 2 of these. And to some extent, digital has allowed you to do a certain level of attribution, which theoretically should make that 50% that Tony said should hopefully come down to about 20% now. Although I'm not quite sure whether that number is the case. Yeah, sorry for the little digital marketing 101 there, but let's get back on track.
It's absolutely fine, and this is simplified, so I think we are allowed to take liberties here. But so Naren, to your point, obviously attribution has improved a lot, but also think about in basic principles what we're trying to solve for, right? It is to show the right ad to the right person at the right time, and that's the holy grail of marketing, as it were. And to break that down into simpler terms, it's just 2 things. Relevance of the ad to you and context in which you see the ad, right? So if you see the most valuable or easily attributable kind of ad, it would be a search ad, because when you're searching for something, advertiser is able to put a product in front of you, right? And obviously you have already exhibited an intent to buy something, and it's likely that you'll purchase, and we are able to track all of that, and therefore Google has thrived on search advertising.
The other benefit to that is that you don't need to be wildly creative in order to succeed over there. You don't need to come out with a more creative or funny ad, even for a boring category like, say, insurance or real estate or something, because the relevance is so super high. And it's a brilliant business model. I take my hats off to Google for stealing or acquiring that idea, whatever as the case may be. I think, and it's what has, what is so staggering is that so much of digital marketing, internet has changed over the last 20 years. But that fundamental business model of Google, which is showing relevant ads against the relevant searches, I think that hasn't changed since 2004, 2005, and it still drives close to 90% of Alphabet's revenues, that those search ads and all that. It's just astonishing, really.
Yeah. So, the basic thing was Google basically got immensely rich on search advertising, right? And the only thing it could do was give more and more real estate to search advertising, which meant that your entire first screen now, if you do a search for something, is likely to be Google ads. But you can't indefinitely keep doing that, because you will probably move on to a different search engine or people just don't click on the ads enough, right? And there's this other famous joke in the industry that the best place to bury a body is in the second page of Google search results. So, so they hit the limit there. So then they were like, okay, what else do we expand into? Because this is obviously the most easy money that is available, because I'm showing it to someone with great degree of relevance and context. How can I further expand this? So the rest of the world was display advertising, which Google was a latecomer into, to be honest. And they had to sort of find a way to do this, right? So Google obviously acquired along the way YouTube and other things. But if you remember from the old blogging days, there used to be a product called AdSense, which you could opt into, which basically said that if you have your blog and lots of people are coming with refined taste, because it's the autobiography of an ordinary man, can you make some money off it, right? So basically Google allowed bloggers to give the inventory to Google. Then Google uses its network powers to actually find advertisers and place an ad there, right? So that was the simple kind of thing that was available to it. So it had basically certain ad inventory in certain spaces. But now, what has changed basically is that we spoke of something called real-time bidding, or the auction that happens when a display ad needs to be shown, right? So obviously this has to take place in some kind of marketplace. And in digital advertising, that is called an ad exchange, basically. I mean, it's not a very complicated term, but this is where, Cats R Us and Coconut Oil bid to sort of say, I want to show an ad to Chuck, right? So if you look at the entire spectrum, there are 3 or 4 parts to it. One is the website that you've loaded, which has the space for an ad. And that is what we call a publisher. Okay. Now, once the page is loaded, there needs to be someone to tell the ad exchange, which is the marketplace where bids happen, that a space has opened up, right? And this is done by an intermediary called an ad server. Okay. What the ad server does is it has to pass on the information. 2 things it has to pass on. One is that this space is available. 2, that it is Chuck, right? Because at the end of the day, that's how someone decides whether it is of value or not. So the ad server takes this information and passes it on to the ad exchange and the advertisers at the end. So think of your cat products and coconut oil. And cat products and coconut oil need a way to submit what the value of that particular ad slot is to the ad exchange. And they do that via a product at their end, right? So on the demand side, if you want to call that. But basically, there are these, let's say, 5 entities, right? One is the publisher at this end, and at the other end is the advertiser. In between, there is an ad exchange where the bidding happens. And there is an ad server which passes on the information about the user and the publisher to the ad exchange. And on the buyer side, there is a tool that they need to submit their bids. Okay. So think of a scenario in which
buyer, you mean buyer of ads? Buyer of ad space.
Yeah.
Buyer of ad space.
The advertiser.
Advertiser. Yeah. The advertiser. So think of a scenario in which all of these, this pipeline is basically dominated by one company, right? And it has interests in all of this. That is basically what Google is today. And that's what the whole litigation is about. Okay, that's a lot to...
No, wait a minute. So let me rephrase it in my whatever ignorant way. So Google owns the it owns the ad server. So if you want to get onto the ad server, you have to pay Google. It doesn't own it owns the user interface as well. So if the guy is clicking the website, Google is the one who knows that he's clicking that website or whatever. So, or that search. So that space is opened up. So even that Google knows.
Yeah.
And then, so they know that, this space is available. They own the, all the space where all potential advertisers can go and bid for that. So that auction house they own.
Yeah.
And they own the platform where this bidding happens.
Essentially,
So,
yes.
yeah.
So how did it, I mean, obviously this couldn't have happened overnight. How did they establish the monopoly? Why it is a monopoly, and why therefore is there this concern right now, right? So that's the crux of what we'll dive into after another quick break.
Have you ever wondered where the business world is headed? How the ways in which we create, market, and sell to consumers will evolve? Or if we'll ever go back to wearing pants while working? For answers to all of this and more, tune into Advertising is Dead with me, Varun Dugirala. Every Tuesday, as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond. You can catch all episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IBM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.
Welcome back to part 3 of our look at everything like digital advertising, antitrust, how the world has changed, coconut oil. This is like a wide-ranging episode. Before the break, Tony tried his level best to try and simplify this complicated ad tech landscape, and he has successfully managed to tell Naren what that's all about. So well done, yeah.
This reminds me of an old Harry Belafonte song. It says, it was clear as mud, but it covered the ground. The confusion made my head go round. So that's pretty much the state I'm in now, but I'm sure Tony is going to gently pull me out of that.
Or kick you in a little deeper. Kick in a little deeper. Yeah. It's a little, is that meme is there, right? The that hand sticking out of the mud and that person giving a high five. Wow, these it becomes so bad when you try to explain what these memes are through the podcast medium. Anyway, Tony.
The simplest way to understand how this monopoly would have come about, let's go back to the advertiser, right? Now, we said search is very important because it is where people are looking for me, and I definitely need to advertise there. Okay. So as an advertiser, I need to be definitely connected to Google search, right? Yeah. And the world's second biggest search engine is YouTube, right? So if I want to show ads on YouTube, again, I have to be advertising with Google, right? So that's two major chunks of different types of advertising that I can cover. The third part is everything else, which are these banner ads that appear everywhere. Now, if Google has a solution for that also, why will I go to a different kind of advertiser, right? Unless I'm like a large agency and I have different these things. As far as an advertiser is concerned, this covers about 90% of the spectrum of the internet, except for Facebook, which is a separate entity. But basically, since Facebook and Google are never going to talk to each other, it makes sense for you to sort of do a lot of these things with Google alone, right? So on the advertiser side, you have a very easy platform, which is like Google Ads, right? Through which you can target people on search, on YouTube, and on different types of banner and display advertising. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, therefore, what value should Google add to make sure that the in-between space, which Google doesn't own, right, which is search and YouTube is its own, but the rest of the internet is a free, wild country, right? And at all points in time, all advertisers get calls from different sort of publishers, agencies saying, look, we can give you twice the returns that X is giving you, Y is giving you. And obviously, like, because you have to spend your time in office, you end up meeting them. And humans in general can be a little bit more persuasive than algorithms face to face, right? So there is a lot of scope for others to come into play. So what Google essentially needs to do is thrive on being able to provide a lot more value than the other players in the market, right? So when this started, I spoke of the ad server, right, which is at the publisher or the person who's holding the ad inventory or the website level. they need an ad server to basically tell people that I have space available, and also to figure out which ad to show ultimately, right? Yeah. So Google went ahead and bought one of the ad servers which were there, right? And that just operates on just a fee, a license fee, right? It doesn't get a per transaction value or anything. So it is a very standard.
Fee, yeah, just membership fee. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a very commoditized product. And at that point in time, when Google bought it, DoubleClick, as it is called, had about 47% of the market share, right? And then Google renamed it to Google Ad Manager or something, GAM. I think today it has about 90% market share, right? So what happened essentially was Google said, look, when they bought it, obviously they had to say that it is not getting into a monopoly and all of that, right? So their contention was the ad server is a completely disconnected part of this universe. And basically any publisher can offer any ad server, because at the end of the day, it is just determining which ad to show to which user, right? So therefore, there is no conflict of interest. Now, then what Google did was basically once it bought this ad server, it could do one major important thing, right? Which is to send information about the user to different ad exchanges, right? Where the bidding actually happens. That determines value, right? So knowing whether it's Chuck, Naren, or Tony is very important for the end advertiser to actually submit a meaningful bid. Now, what if Google owns the ad server and it refuses to send that information to ad exchanges that are not Google's?
Surely they wouldn't do that. They have a motto called "Don't be evil." No,
yeah. which is why you approach it from the other side to say, "Oh no, user privacy." So Google says, okay, you're right that all of this information is available to the user, but as a company deeply abiding by the privacy of our users, we refuse to send this information to non-Google entities, because then it would, be paramount to transferring data to a separate entity. Within Google, we can use it, of course, because it is encrypted. We already have that data, so why not?
It's really, really scary when MBAs start thinking like lawyers.
Yeah, I know.
So they went ahead and did that, right? So what that meant was there are multiple ad exchanges also. So Google's ad exchange is one of them. There are other ad exchanges as well, right? So as a publisher, I can say, look, this space is available. All of you guys bid for it and just get me the highest price. That is my interest as the website. But now Google's ad exchange had a great advantage because this information is being passed on, right? And for advertisers to consume it, you still need to be on a Google platform. So that's one part, which is to say a massive part of what makes this real-time auction valuable is information about the user, which is monopolized by Google in the guise of privacy, right? So that's beautiful. The second part is the ad server actually also has to determine which is the winning bid amongst multiple different exchanges. So in each ad exchange, multiple advertisers put in their bid. There will be one winner. Okay, so let's say in Google's ad exchange, $1 was the value assigned to Chuck. Now there is another ad exchange, let's say Open Ad Exchange, where $2 was the value assigned to Chuck. Right. So now these two ad exchanges sit in parallel. It is for the ad server to then say, okay, the winning bid of $2 and $1 is $2. So, it goes to the Open Ad Exchange, right? So as opposed to the ad server, where the fee is actually a license fee for exchanges, like similar to, let's say, financial markets, the fee is per transaction, right? So if Google's ad exchange is able to win it at $1, what it pays to the publisher would be like, 80 cents or whatever, right? So it will keep a certain amount of that with itself. And this is per transaction, which is actually where the value is as opposed to a license fee, right? So there is a genuine conflict of interest because now Google's ad server will want to try and make sure Google's ad exchange wins all of the bids because they can take money by the truckloads. Yeah, Naren's looking
Making
confused.
sense, Naren?
Yeah.
Is that look on your face right now, and listeners obviously can't see this, is the look on your face one of trying to parse this whole thing together, or just shock at how young Google?
No, I'm just trying to parse the whole thing together, and how actually exquisitely simple the racket is actually.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So,
That's the astonishing part about it, right?
I mean, you take all the coding and all the tech apart. It's the oldest fucking game.
So that's the polarizing part about this particular discussion. You viscerally want to hate Google for doing this, but also you admire them for having the balls to pull it off in such a way. Yeah. Anyway, Tony, let's.
So that's one part. One part is Google basically monopolizes the information available about the user and refuses to pass it on. It's not 100% thing, but by and large, they don't pass it on, which means Google's ad exchange and Google's the people who use Google advertising platforms at their end to buy inventory have an advantage because they have more information. The second part is, now let us say the ad exchange has to pick the winner amongst different bids, right? So what if all of this didn't happen in parallel, right? So let's say the ad exchanges actually worked in a waterfall model. So you arrange, let's say there are 5 ad exchanges. Ad server sends it to all of them, looks at the bid from the first one, looks at the bid from the second one, third one, fourth one, and fifth one, right? And the fifth one would be Google's ad exchange. Mm-hmm. What it would do is look at the bid value submitted by the other 4 and bid 1 cent higher.
Wow.
Because then they get the...
Yeah. This basically sends you to prison if you do it in a stock market context.
Exactly.
Manacled and gone inside in the US.
Exactly. So what Google tells the publisher is, look, you're getting more than what the other ad exchange would have paid, because we are giving you this advantage, saying we are willing to buy it at a cent more or whatever. But effectively, the ad server is now rigging the game because it is supposed to be an open auction, which it is not anymore, right? So based on these two things, they made a ton of money. Sorry for the profanity, but I don't think there is
no other way.
That should be a SI unit of money.
So
that got me laughing so much, Naren, that I actually knocked my mic, or it fell onto my lap, and then my speakers got activated and stuff like that as well. So, yeah. I was laughing out loud, and my mic was on the floor rolling.
Yeah. So at this point, obviously, the other ad exchanges were like, what the hell, right? I mean, you can't obviously do this. Is nonsense. We won't allow this to happen. So they found a competitive way to overcome this, which is to say, let's not route this bidding process through the ad server. Okay, the ad server's responsibility is only to finally, check which ad needs to be shown to the user. You get out of all of this, we will implement something called header bidding, which is to say, before the ad server can wake up to the idea that an ad needs to be shown, the publisher can actually send this information to all of the exchanges, right? So now what happens is all of them will basically bid openly, right? Rather than this waterfall model where Google was paying 1 penny more. Now all of them have to bid in parallel, right? Which obviously means that Google either has to pay a higher amount or it doesn't win as many auctions in the ad exchange, leading to a direct loss in revenue for them. But for the publisher, this actually resulted, who holds the ad inventory, this actually resulted in about a 30% improvement in their yields, right? Because now it is a truly open market. This is how it is supposed to be. So then Google said, we won't allow header bidding. Right. And why? Because now this action actually happens on the user's browser or at our side, right? Which means Google claimed that it is slowing down websites because you guys are doing this, right? And they were like, okay, we hear your concerns. We'll also do parallel bidding, but in the Google model, routed through the ad server, we'll still do it in something called open bidding, right? So they wanted to kill header bidding at any cost, right? So this litigation actually shows the transcripts, and the terminology they've used, Google internally, is to say we need to pull a Jedi mind trick on publishers to make them stop doing this header bidding because it is losing us money. Now, again, you can't go and tell the publisher that we are losing money, so don't do it. They're like, it is slowing down the experience for the users. What is wrong with you? Your website now takes so much time to load. People will not come to your website. Your traffic is going to go down. And what is more, in Google search, we will penalize you because your website is now performing suboptimally because it's taking too long to load. Right? So earlier the principle was privacy. Now it is user experience. But basically, Google said, stop doing this, or we will penalize you in other ways. And obviously, publishers started seeing this loss in traffic from search or otherwise, and they had to sort of go back to either open bidding or something else.
So the TLDR of the entire thing till now, and I assume where you're going as well, because you said another very ominous then, is that Google does everything possible to protect its turf, and its revenues, basically. That's basically the TLDR of the entire thing, right?
Yeah, and they've basically bought out the whole value chain, and then they've started either imposing penalties for not using it or something else. So the other thing they did with header bidding was that now if your winning bid was not from a Google ad exchange, we'll still charge you a 10% commission because it's not going through the standard Google process. So, whatever, we'll still make money. So all of this happened, and now they're all waiting in 2017 saying, will anyone take on Google? And up steps Facebook saying, we support header bidding.
Not the hero we needed, but all right.
Facebook steps in to say, we support header bidding.
Yeah, that genuinely feels like a scene in Avengers where Thanos is like rising up and everybody like, okay, we need somebody who can counter this guy. And the Joker comes. And you're like, at that point, you're like, okay, like, this is not completely a bad idea, but not sure whether this is the right person for the job. But up comes Facebook, and
Yeah. So why does Facebook need to be in all of this display if it's a walled garden, right? So all of the ads on Facebook are shown by it, but they also have an extension of their ads called Facebook Audience Network, which basically,
you can be a fan of.
Which basically you can advertise on other websites where publishers have allowed for this inventory. So how does Facebook show that ad? Again, it has to go via an ad exchange. And again, it has to come up against Google. And again, to win against Google, it has to go with header bidding, right? But it is not the biggest share of Facebook's revenue, to be honest, right? So they just wanted to put some kida, basically make Google shit their pants, because if Facebook stands up to Google, then it is trouble. So then this went on for about a year, and then these guys actually met behind the scenes and reached an agreement called...
When you say these guys, you mean Facebook and Google,
Facebook
right?
and Google,
yeah. Facebook and Google reached an agreement is not a line that you want to see anywhere.
So they basically said, look, you guys... stay away from header bidding. Instead, we'll give you stuff, right? And stuff is, we said that user information wouldn't be passed on to other servers. Google said for Facebook, we will allow access to the user information.
Such a nice company.
And we will also basically give you extra time to bid. So we'll give you 300 milliseconds as opposed to other players would get only about 150 milliseconds, right? So you have both time and you have information, but you have to pledge that you will, basically advertise at X amount for the year, right? So Google anyway makes money, but Facebook wins a lot of the auctions, which means it can basically take that money from the advertiser, right? So it's a win-win for Facebook and Google. So that's the basic thing that happened. So, and
Wow.
that's essentially where we stand, right? So there is obviously a lot more to go into, but the fundamental idea is, as an advertiser, you can't move out of Google because it gives you the greatest possible advertising tools. Search, you need to advertise on. YouTube, you probably need to advertise on. And the rest of the internet, if it is controlled by Google, I definitely need to advertise on it, right? So the other thing is, participating in an ad exchange is a very costly affair, even for a publisher. So not anyone can sign up to the ad exchange, right? To be in an ad exchange, you need at least 10 million page views in a month, or some like really crazy figure like that. Yeah. So as a smaller publisher, right, if you don't have the ability to take part in an ad exchange, you need to go to something called an ad network, which is where you give up control of your inventory to a third party, but they basically buy out your inventory and take the risk of selling that as well, right? And again, Google's display network is the biggest
number
ad
one
network.
So basically they control the entire chain.
Entire chain. Now, if you remember, we did one topic around federated learning of cohorts, which has also a mention in this whole anti-litigation, right? So after all of this, Google came up with something called Project Nera. So Naren, I don't know if you remember, long back we did a episode on Google's federated learning of cohorts, which also finds a mention in this litigation basically text, right? So what Google was trying to do was create its own walled garden. So if you go to some websites, it'll say continue as, naren@gmail.com, right? And it'll basically try to get you to sign in. This happens on Chrome. The idea being that obviously because 60% of the world uses Chrome, that is a significant amount of data. And if you are able to get people's information, then it adds even more value, right? For both the publisher and the advertiser. And then obviously all sorts of privacy things happened. Then Google said, we'll introduce something called the privacy sandbox, which also results in something like Flock, where they say now we won't identify people at an individual level. We'll only identify them as cohorts. But so that's the end-to-end spectrum of Google's tentacles in display advertising, analytics, tracking, measurement, to your earlier point, all of this, right? So it basically, like we started at the beginning, data is clearly the new oil, and there is only one.
There's one thing that actually raises my respect for the American way of doing things, is that there are actually a bunch of people there who recognize this, is bad in general, and are taking up cudgels against it. And it's not yet a given whether they will win or what. But the fact that there is opinion that it sort of is likely to hold back these corporations from becoming even more evil than they are already at the moment, which is kind of good.
Yeah.
I mean, really, admiration. Whoever's doing this, I think that.
So just to be clear, now you are admiring the people inside Google, right? I want to be clear because And the scary
don't be evil. If you want to be evil, then be really like
evil, really
in an intelligent way.
The scary part about all this is that Tony has spent the last 1 hour or so talking just about Google. The fact of the matter is Facebook is almost as, I don't want to say the word evil, but Facebook is almost as monopoly-like when it comes to data. But that's, again, literally another talk show by itself. But it has its own parallels with what...
In fact, I really do think we should do one on that because that is also, you always hear very nebulous bad things said about Facebook, but no one really knows why Facebook is bad, right? So, what? So yeah, that's definitely something worth simplifying.
Interesting. Maybe a discussion.
So all you lawyers in the US, please file an antitrust motion soon so we can and then simplify for our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, not that Facebook needs yet another one of those in its inbox. I mean, I think that's the only thing that's missing. There's pretty much everything else has filed against it. So yeah, but that's another episode for sure. Yeah, I guess that's about it. So just to sum up the entire thing, Tony, Google controls the entire chain from publisher, or rather, from publisher, from me all the way to a hair oil company or cat company. They get their cuts out of everything. It's a brilliant business model, but one that's extremely extractive, one that's very efficient in getting me to buy products, but might not be the best thing from a competition point of view, making companies scared to start their own businesses and so on and so forth, all that sort of thing. And they are doing whatever they can to guard their turf, basically, so that they can just get growing bigger. And everything that they do, whether it is privacy or when they're taking stances on FLoC and all that, is basically just to protect their own turf or grow their own moat, as it were. This is broadly the takeaway, the layperson's takeaway from this, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, basically it says it's like, it being a cricket match and Google being the batter, bowler, and umpire. They obviously use baseball terms, but basically that's how it is. So they have tremendous conflict of interest across the board, and publishers lose out because Google is not trying to optimize for them, although they're supposed to. And obviously advertisers also have to pay a higher amount. So while Google grows.
Well, they say, you know what they say about businesses that start in garages. Actually, I don't. But it's fair to say that they've come a long way since the days of "Don't be evil." I think that's something that's very clearly. Alas, on that sad note, let us. I have to take, for my own part in this, my browser of choice is actually Microsoft Edge. In my fighting back in my own little way, it's actually quite nice. And to be very honest, you don't see too much of a difference. So yeah, I think we should end this. For some reason, Naren is not here, so I think we will have to end it on his behalf. So Tony, would you want to take a stab? Stay
safe. Stay safe, stay oiled, and stay simplified.
Sure, why not? Let's go with that. We are not as good as Naren, we'll do this. All right. Bye, everyone, and see you next time. Hope this was enlightening to some of you. And if there are any of you actually if any of you actually control the ad tech at Google, then do get in touch. We'd love to have you on the show. Soon. Bye.
Bye.
Hey, everybody. It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus talks to a close friend and veteran actor Dolly Thakur about her new book, Regrets None, and her amazing career spanning over 5 decades. On Tere Mere Raaste, Keshav travels to the Pearl of the Hills, Mussoorie. Discover a city that cherishes her tourist spots as much as her famous residents. Our taglines, a relic of the past. On Sparta with Sid, Siddharth analyzes whether taglines still hold relevance in today's world. On GabyCity, Farhad and Sunetra reflect on the perks and quirks of living with family. And on Hans Fonding, hear an interesting story, Neem Ki Pattiya, voiced by Casey Shankar and written by Sarang Upadhyay. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, do check out our various YouTube channels. You can catch them on IVM Podcast/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quota, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Play Coffee, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Do you wonder why China does the things that it does? Or want to know how we could improve online privacy? Or perhaps you're thinking about how we can kickstart India's economy. If you'd like to search for the answers to such questions, check out All Things Policy, a daily public policy podcast that covers everything from employment figures to aircraft carriers. Tune in from Monday to Friday for new episodes and fresh takes.